What's the scariest thing you saw in someone's home that they treated as normal? One time I was at my friend's house, and after playing some Mario Kart or something, we wanted to go outside to play, probably around fifth grade at the time. We went downstairs to his washroom, which connected to the hallway that led outside, and the room was flooding fast. There was at least an inch of water covering the floor, and we called his parents, who ran in and quickly figured out that their washing machine's water drain sink was clogged. Then it came out that they also used that sink as a toilet, that exact sink. Apparently all the time, like it was totally normal to not use a toilet and just casually crap in the thing that is meant to clean you. They claimed the drain was big enough to handle it, but I did not look because that was already way too much for me. About a minute later, I realized my shoes were sitting in that disgusting water, so I walked home barefoot with my shoes sealed in a plastic bag. Those shoes were never the same again, and honestly, they deserved a full funeral. Story 2. When I was 16, my family moved to a very small town, and the school there went from kindergarten all the way through 12th grade. I became friends with a girl whose father was a pastor at one of the local churches. One day after school, we went to her house, and she introduced me to her mom, her older brother, and her dad. After that, we went back to her room to hang out. It was an extremely hot and swampy day, so she stripped down to just her bra and underwear and did not put anything else on. I thought it was a little strange, but she seemed totally comfortable with it, so I brushed it off. She asked if I wanted a snack, and when I said yes, she suggested we go to the kitchen. I assumed she would put on some clothes since the rest of her family was there, but she did not. We walked into the kitchen with her almost naked, and nobody in her family seemed bothered or surprised at all. At one point, she even sat on her older brother's lap like it was nothing. It was not as extreme as some other stories people share, but at the time, it felt incredibly strange to witness. Story 3. I was walking through town with my buddy once when we suddenly ran into one of his old friends, a guy he had not seen in several years. After the usual small talk, the guy suggested we come back to his place for a coffee or something. Since he lived nearby, we figured why not and walked back with him while talking. When we got there, the place was absolutely disgusting. Not just dirty, but complete chaos. There were objects thrown everywhere. The sink was piled high with cutlery, toys from his kid were scattered all over the place, and there was barely any clear space at all. He also had a dog, and the whole place smelled kind of off. He offered us coffee and then suddenly realized there were no clean cups, so he grabbed 2 mugs from the coffee table, which was almost invisible under all the junk, put them down in front of his dog, let the dog lick the leftover coffee out, and then immediately started making fresh coffee without washing the mugs. We both just sat there holding the cups, pretending to take sips now and then, and left shortly after. He did the whole thing like it was the most normal behavior in the world. Story 4. Have you ever been inside the home of someone with obsessive-compulsive disorder? The woman who used to live across the street from us definitely had it. Every morning at 7 o'clock, she would come out of her house with perfect hair and makeup and immediately begin her routine. Her lawn was flawless, cut with an extremely expensive mower like something used on a golf course. The curb was lined with bricks, and every single day she would go along the curb with a toothbrush and clean between each brick. She even swept her grass, and her son was not allowed to play on it at all. The bushes and flowers were trimmed perfectly at all times. The first time I went inside her house, I was honestly afraid to move. We were not allowed to step on the rug in the entryway, and the tassels on the ends were perfectly straightened, like they had been ironed. You would never have guessed a child lived in that house, and it had to be a miserable way for him to grow up. Story 5. I remember going over to a classmate's house when I was around 10 or 11. I cannot remember her real name, but I think it was Susie, and even if it was not, she is Susie for the story. She did not have many friends, so my mom arranged a sleepover with her mom. The family was a little strange in several ways. First of all, they all referred to each other only by family titles, constantly saying things like mother, father, or sister, even during normal conversations, like asking someone to pass the butter. Susie told me they rented some movies for the sleepover, which sounded great, but they actually rented one single movie and watched it 3 times in a row. Darby O'Gill and the Little People. Later on, Susie said I could take a bath since they did not have a shower. When she showed me the bathroom, the bathtub was already full of water. She explained that the family shared the same bath water and that guests were supposed to go first, then everyone else would go after. I politely declined and spent the rest of the night mentally counting down the minutes until my mom came to pick me up the next morning. Also, her mom put mayonnaise in the mashed potatoes. Story 6. Sadly, it was not even someone else's house. It was the flat I lived in with 3 other people. I was friends with 2 of them, and the third was a girl who joined when we were looking for a new flatmate. She seemed like a really nice, bubbly person at first. After about 2 months of living together, we started noticing kitchen stuff going missing. It was very obvious because the kitchen was overloaded with things, to the point that cupboards would not even close properly. Cutlery, plates, bowls, and glasses slowly started disappearing. I brought it up with the others, and they said they had noticed it too, but could not explain where everything was going. We asked the new girl, and she said she had no idea, blaming the previous girl who lived with us and claiming she had seen her move out with loads of stuff. About 2 months later, there were literally no bowls left and barely any cutlery or plates, so I finally lost it and went into this girl's room. The place was absolutely disgusting, a complete dump. The floor was not even visible because it was buried under piles of junk. There were stacks of empty takeaway boxes everywhere and personal hygiene items scattered on the floor. I started looking around and found bowl after bowl and plate after plate, everything that had gone missing. All of it was dirty and moldy. Some of the cutlery was even rusty. It was revolting. The weirdest thing of all was a dirty plate with a pile of mustard on it, left on her bed under the covers. When we confronted her, she broke down crying, and she moved out of the flat the following week. Story 7. When I was in 4th grade, I stayed overnight for the first time at a friend's house. His whole family was incredibly nice and gave us free reign of the huge farm they lived on. They had 3-wheelers, go-karts, dirt bikes, and even jet skis for the pond out back. The place felt like heaven to a kid. Nothing felt strange until the next morning. We had slept outside in tents, and I woke up last. I ran into the house to find my friend and completely froze when I reached the kitchen. His entire family was there, sitting at or standing around the table. His mom, dad, older brother, and 2 older sisters. They were all wearing plain white shirts and nothing else, acting like this was totally normal. His mom told me to sit down and said breakfast was almost ready. I awkwardly did, trying not to stare and pretending everything was fine. Everyone was walking around getting food, hugging each other, and talking about the day as if nothing was unusual at all. I never said a word to my friend about it, and despite how strange that moment was, I stayed over at his place many more times all the way through high school. Between all the fun stuff they had and how welcoming they were, I just never brought it up again. Story 8. When I was 8 years old, I was friends with a girl from my neighborhood. This was back when no one thought twice about letting groups of kids walk around the neighborhood alone to visit friends a few blocks away. We usually played outside near a small playground and rarely went inside anyone's house. One day it started to drizzle while we were at the playground, and she invited us to her house to play. We were excited because she had an Atari, so we agreed. Her entire family had very pale blonde hair, almost albino looking, including her parents and brothers. Her mother was a chubby woman with red cheeks who seemed kind and gave us cookies. We played Atari in the living room for a while. Then she took us upstairs toward her bedroom. On the way, she stopped at a tall bookcase in the hallway and showed us some picture books her dad shared with her, saying they were for games they played. Inside the books were glossy magazines with images of adults in very inappropriate poses. She explained very casually that her dad showed these to her and that sometimes they copied what they saw, not understanding that it was wrong. She asked if any of us did similar things at home and said it made her feel strange, though she did not know why. She also mentioned noticing a stain in her underwear one day and not knowing what it meant. This was the late 1970s, and at 8 years old, I did not fully understand what was happening, only that something felt deeply wrong. At the time, you did not go home and talk to your parents about things like that. Years later, when I remembered it as an adult, I was horrified. By then, I had lost contact with her, and I still find myself wondering what happened to her. That memory has never really left me. Story 9. I had not thought about this for many years, but it is still a good story. I was working as a telemarketer at a large call center around the year 2000, and basically everyone there was a heavy pot smoker, including me. After work one day, I went with a guy I barely knew to his rundown little apartment to buy a bag from him. While we were there, he started showing me some of his stuff, and the strangest thing by far was an actual bazooka. I am talking about a real shoulder-launched, Second World War-looking bazooka, not some replica. Things got even stranger when his very unsettling-looking girlfriend showed up, and as I was trying to do the usual polite routine of realizing it was time to leave, an older guy pulled up outside. It turned out to be the girlfriend's father, someone she had apparently never met before. There were tears, awkward hugs, and lines like how nice it was to finally put a face to a voice. I was way too high for that entire situation, so I quietly removed myself from the scene as fast as I could. Story 10. I was dating an Asian girl, and like many Asian families, her extended family all lived together in one large house. Her grandparents, her mother, her aunt, and her cousin all lived there. I had been over several times before and never really paid attention, but the first night I stayed over, I noticed something strange. They turned the bedroom lights off to sleep, but left every other light in the house turned on all night. I asked my girlfriend why they did that, and she explained that her family believed they were saving energy by using energy-saving light bulbs, and that leaving them on would somehow result in a cheaper electricity bill. I explained to her that it actually did not work that way, and she understood once I told her, but she said she would never tell her family because she was not allowed to correct or challenge her elders. So the lights stayed on, every night, forever. Story 11. This was my first real white trash experience. I went over to this kid's house, let's call him Cletus, supposedly to play video games. The very first thing that happened when we arrived was his uncle calling us over to a couch sitting on the lawn to show us a mess his niece, Cletus's sister, had made earlier. There was an adult toy sitting right there, and the first thing Cletus did when he saw it was touch it, smell his finger, and laugh. I just stood there completely stunned. After that, he showed me their pit bull that they kept chained up in the backyard. The dog was extremely aggressive, and they kept antagonizing it with a baseball bat like it was entertainment. At that point, I made up an excuse to leave and got out of there as fast as possible. I never spoke to Cletus again, which was not hard since he dropped out of school not long after. This all happened back when we were still in middle school. Story 12. I once stayed the night at my great-grandmother's house. She and her husband were extremely old and had separate bedrooms, which made sense because at that age, you probably just want some peace. That night, they decided to sleep in the same bed so I could have a room to myself. The house was made of cinder blocks and smelled like old people, biscuit dough, collard greens, and sweet tea. As I lay in the bed that night, I kept a lamp on and looked around the room. The walls were covered with countless pictures of my great-grandfather, our family, his friends, and people I did not recognize. Everything was covered in dust. The sheets felt ancient, and the room smelled like they had tried to wash them at some point. They kept the house at an unbelievably high temperature, so between the heat and the smell, I could not sleep. I tried opening a window and realized it was sealed shut from being painted over too many times. While standing there, I noticed something shiny under the bed, and curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down, pulled it out, and immediately heard a sloshing sound. It was a chamber pot. Inside, it was exactly what you would expect, and the smell hit me instantly. I gagged and ended up throwing up into it. Panicking, I slid it back under the bed and spent the rest of the night sleeping in the living room, later claiming I had fallen asleep while reading. After that, I only went back for Christmas. Story 13. In college, I was casually dating a guy, and neither of us ever gave anyone the impression that it was a serious relationship. One weekend, he invited me to his parents' house because he knew I lived in a terrible apartment with terrible roommates, the kind who would give each other haircuts in the living room and not even bother to clean up afterward. And all I had to eat was instant noodles and an endless supply of roaches. I met his parents, and they seemed nice enough, saying they would hang out in the living room while he and I cooked dinner in the kitchen. At some point, his mom overheard us joking about attractive celebrities or something harmless like that, when she suddenly shouted that her baby boy might not be perfect, but that it helped that he was circumcised. I laughed awkwardly, trying to act like I had never seen his body before, silently wondering where this conversation was going. She then said she could prove it if I did not know. I looked at him, and he did not seem bothered at all, so I looked back at her just in time to see her pull a jar out of the cupboard. Inside was his foreskin, preserved, a 20-year-old pickled foreskin sitting casually on the kitchen shelf like it was completely normal. Story 14. I am going to flip the idea and share one that felt completely normal to me at the time, even though everyone else thought it was strange. When I was around 14, I lived in my parents' finished basement, with my room in the back. I started noticing that bees, specifically yellow jackets, were getting into my room constantly, several every single day. I had a drop ceiling, and when I lifted one of the tiles, I discovered they had built a nest right above my ceiling through the light fixtures. I told my mom, and she said she would call an exterminator. About 5 months passed with no exterminator, and I had completely adjusted. There were bees flying around my room all day and night, and I barely noticed them anymore, like I was living inside a hive. One day I was in my room playing video games from that era when I heard my mom come down the stairs. She rarely came into my room because she respected my privacy, but that day she walked in, saw the swarm of bees, and absolutely lost it. I was immediately banned from my room for almost a week while they dealt with the infestation. I had been telling her about the bees regularly, but she had assumed it was just the occasional insect wandering in. Not that my entire room was essentially part of the hive. Somehow, despite living like that for months, I never got stung once, probably because I was so calm around them. Story 15. When I was recruiting for the military, a couple came to my office because they wanted their son to enlist. They invited me over for dinner, and as a single guy in my 20s, I was not about to turn down a home-cooked meal. I got their address and told them I would be there at 6. I arrived during a heavy downpour and immediately noticed there was no grass or walkway, so I trudged through mud, thankful for my combat boots, and knocked on the door. While waiting, I realized the house had no siding and appeared to be made entirely of cheap plywood, just compressed wood chips glued together. I assumed they were renovating and that the inside would be better. I was very wrong. When they opened the door, I was hit with the overwhelming smell of old cigarettes, like several people smoked multiple packs a day indoors. Inside, piles of junk were everywhere, and there were no clear paths, just stepping from spot to spot like a game of the floor is lava. As I navigated through the mess, I noticed the entire house, walls, floors, and ceiling was made of that same cheap plywood. Because of the rain, the wood was soaking wet, and the ceiling was sagging badly, at least 2 feet. The entire time I was thinking about how fast I could escape if the place collapsed. There were no real doors anywhere, only a sheet hanging in front of the bathroom. In the kitchen, the mother started cooking while smoking, ashes falling freely, wiping a dirty pan with a filthy rag instead of washing it. As the roof began leaking, the father casually placed buckets underneath while continuing conversation like nothing was wrong. When it was time to set the table, she took dirty dishes and silverware straight from the sink, wiped them with that same rag, and placed them out. I forced a smile, trying not to gag. Eventually their son arrived, a 17-year-old with a massive purple mohawk and dozens of tattoos. I went through the enlistment requirements, explaining that many of his tattoos would need to be removed, including ones with extremist symbols and offensive phrases. He then asked how to remove tattoos mentioning lemon juice, and while I tried to explain that was not how it worked, his father started telling me wild stories about being an enforcer for drug cartels decades earlier. While this was happening, the son actually began trying to remove his tattoos himself. When I attempted to leave, the father insisted on showing me his gun collection, and since he clearly seemed unstable, I went along. Strangely enough, the garage was completely normal, well-built, clean, and finished, and I have never understood why they lived in such a disaster of a house, but maintained a perfect 3-stall garage. Story 16. Somewhere around 6th grade, I stayed over at a friend's house for the first time, which also happened to be my first sleepover since moving to a new state. We spent the day doing the usual kid stuff outside, chasing his sister around and setting off firecrackers because his family ran a stand and he had access to tons of them. When it came time to sleep, we headed downstairs to what they called the kids area, which was basically a playroom and bedroom in the basement. My friend asked me if I wanted to see something cool, then lifted up a sheet of plywood in the middle of the room and revealed a large hole underneath. They had been digging a tunnel from inside the house to the outside. His parents knew about it and apparently did not care at all. They had broken straight through the foundation and dug the tunnel out about 10 feet. There were no supports of any kind inside it, and my friend casually mentioned that a lot of spiders came in through the hole too, specifically large and aggressive ones. I did not sleep very well that night. Story 17. While I was in graduate school, I worked part-time walking dogs for a small local business that handled dog walks, daycare, and training. I loved animals, and it was a nice break from studying, except for one house. The first time I showed up there, the owners were not home, which was normal, and I had been given a key. According to the notes, I was supposed to walk 2 dogs, but only one greeted me at the door. I searched the house for the second one but found nothing, and the place was almost completely empty. I went into the kitchen to look for treats and found them in the refrigerator alongside a large bottle of soda, a bottle of ketchup, and a bottle of mustard, which were the only food items in the entire house. I walked the first dog, assuming the second one might appear while I was gone. When I came back, there was still no sign of it, so I noticed a basement door and went down there calling the dog's name. There were no lights, so I relied on what little light came from upstairs. On the stair landing, there was a litter box filled to the brim, despite there being no cats or signs of cats anywhere. As I stepped into the basement, my feet sank into ankle-deep piles of something soft and spongy. I felt uneasy but thought I heard movement, so I took a few more steps forward, calling the dog again. Just as I was about to give up, something brushed against my face, and I ran out of there faster than I ever had in my life. I had to return the following week, and the entire time I genuinely expected something terrible to happen down in that basement. Story 18. This might be a stretch, but when I was around 12, I went to a friend's house and started realizing we were drifting apart. We used to play games together all the time, but he had started getting into sports and hunting while I had become completely focused on gaming. This was my last visit. We played on his console for a while, but he got bored and went outside, leaving me alone in his room still playing. When he came back, he was dressed casually, and at some point things took an unexpected and confusing turn that neither of us really understood at the time. Shortly after his parents came home, we went to sleep, and I left the next morning like nothing had happened. He came over to my house once more after that, but we never talked about it. His mother later became my school bus driver, and years later we ended up at the same high school, riding the same bus, but we kept our distance. Now we even share a class, and he spends his time joking loudly with his friends, often making comments that feel pointed. Whenever he talks to people we both know, he avoids looking at me. One time he did look at me, and for the first time he stopped smiling and looked genuinely uncomfortable. I still debate whether I should ever bring it up, knowing how his family is, or if it was simply something he never wanted to think about again. Story 19. One of my very best friends growing up lived in a really old house. They had a fire pit in the yard where they regularly burned their garbage, and apparently they even had a permit for it, although I never really knew the details. Their water was permanently rust-colored, to the point that dishes coming out of the dryer looked stained, and it was just considered normal in that house. They were completely used to it, like it was simply a fact of life. But that was not even the strangest part. The toilet was coated in thick black layers from years and years of accumulated rusty water, waste, and buildup. The entire inside of the bowl looked like it had grown a bark made of human refuse. The toilet never actually flushed. Instead, they would pour a bucket of water into it, and the bowl would slowly drain. I avoided using that bathroom as much as humanly possible, but one day I had no choice. The smell was unreal. Imagine the last 10 times you went to the bathroom, all combined into one single moment. Not long before they moved out, they finally replaced that toilet, and for a while the old one just sat out in the yard like a forgotten relic. Story 20. I had a friend whose parents were extreme hoarders. Their house was filled with garbage everywhere, literally everywhere. Their dining room was used as a litter box for their 13 dogs and 7 cats. They did not seem to understand what trash cans were, so garbage piled up endlessly, and the smell was beyond anything I can properly describe. None of the animals were fixed, so nearly every time I visited, there were new puppies or kittens running around. One time I came over, and the smell was noticeably worse than usual, and it turned out that one of the newborn kittens had gotten trapped behind a dresser and died. They only bothered to look for it once the house started smelling like decay. I cried. One of my favorite dogs there was named Junior. I met him the day he was born, and we immediately bonded. Every time I walked through the door, he would run straight to me. I begged my mom to let me keep him, and I even brought him home once, hoping she might fall in love with him like I had, but she did not. One night I went over, and Junior did not greet me. He had been hit by a car, and because his owners had no money and no sense of responsibility, they never took him to the vet. They laid him on a bed and let him suffer in pain for 4 days until he finally died in their living room. I cried again. There was also a very old cat named Tippy Toes, somehow still alive despite the neglect. One day I found him outside and noticed he was in terrible pain due to a severe injury that made it difficult for him to even walk. It was so bad that it dragged behind him when he moved. The family did absolutely nothing about it. I begged someone to help him, or at least end his suffering, but in a house full of grown men, not one of them stepped up. That cat lived like that for an entire month until one day he simply never came back. I still feel ashamed for not calling animal protection services or child services. There was much more going on in that house, but I know I should have done more. All I know is that I love those animals deeply, and every time I visited, I made sure to pet every single one before even speaking to a human. I know they love me too, and I wish I could have taken all of them away. Story 21, I guess this one is not so much weird as it is absolutely disgusting. A couple I knew were kind enough to let me move in with them for a few months, and they had an 8-month-old baby. It did not take long to realize the house was filthy. There was moldy food everywhere, half-filled cans of soda growing mold, and eggs sitting out in the living room for an entire week, all while a crawling baby was moving around and putting things in its mouth. One time the wife actually yelled at me for wasting food when there were blueberries smashed on the floor that they had been stepping on, covered in dirt, and the baby had been eating them anyway. The microwave was completely caked with old food, and the toilet that was supposed to be white was black and covered in hair. They genuinely believed there was nothing wrong with how they kept their house. I refused to cook there because the sink was full of moldy water and bugs. The entire place was beyond filthy. After I finally moved out, I became almost obsessively clean, like a complete clean freak, probably as a reaction to living there. Story 22. This girl I was hooking up with turned out to be a full-blown hoarder. I met her at a local bar. She was cute, funny, and attractive. And the first few times we hooked up, she always came back to my place even though she kept asking to go back to hers. One night she mentioned she had a Wii and wanted to play Mario Kart and Super Smash with me, and I was genuinely excited, thinking I had finally found someone worth my time. That illusion died fast. We got back to her place where she lived upstairs in a relative's house, and at first everything looked normal because the downstairs was clean. Then she opened the door to her room. All I could see was cats and a mountain of trash, half-eaten fast food, wrappers, candy, piles of junk, clothes, cat waste, random personal items, and things I could not even identify were everywhere. The smell was almost worse than the sight. There was a narrow winding path leading to a heavily stained mattress covered in food wrappers and surrounded by cats. I honestly asked her if this was a joke or some kind of prank. She looked at me confused and said it was just a little messy and that she had not cleaned in about a week because she was busy at work. I was pretty drunk by that point, but even then I had enough sense to leave. I told her I forgot my phone and charger in her car, even though they were in my jacket, asked for her keys and used that as my escape. I hesitated briefly when I realized it was about 5 degrees outside with deep snow on the sidewalk, and she lived over 4 miles away. But then I remembered that smell, pulled myself together, and made the worst walk home of my life. Story 23. I have been waiting a long time to tell this one. I do yard work during the summer for an older couple who are both very nice, although the wife is a bit eccentric. She is a serious cat person and always has 7 or 8 cats running around at any given time. One day when I showed up, she told me I would be digging a cat grave. She mentioned that one of her cats was probably going to die soon due to organ failure, so I assumed I was preparing for that. After I finished digging, I was chatting with the husband, and he explained the real reason for the grave. It was not for the cat that was about to die, it was for cats that were already dead. Apparently, when the cats passed away late in the fall, the ground was too hard to dig, so because they wanted to give them a proper burial later, they preserved them in their freezer. He took me down to the basement, opened the freezer, and there they were. Sitting next to the ice cream and above the frozen meat were two dead frozen cats. In the end, they had me bury those frozen cats. The strangest part was that they did not even come outside while I did it. They simply kept their dead pets in frozen storage for over a year and then had me bury them when the ground finally softened. Story 24. I had a friend whose house was absolutely disgusting. First of all, there was a massive hole in the wall in his bedroom. This happened because they had a window air conditioning unit that leaked constantly until the drywall underneath completely collapsed, leaving behind a moldy, crumbling hole. The entire house was filled with garbage and random junk everywhere. Cans, bottles, filthy dishes, just piles of mess in every room. Whenever I went over there, I never took my shoes off, not once. I stayed over multiple weekends, always slept on the couch, and kept my shoes on the entire time. They did not use sheets on their beds at all, and the mattresses themselves were stained brown. The final straw, the moment I never stayed over again, and we quietly started hanging out at other people's houses instead, happened one night when he decided he wanted to make eggs. He pulled out their electric griddle, which was obviously covered in dried food and grime. Normally, we never ate there and would just walk to a gas station late at night, but for some reason, he really wanted eggs. Another friend and I stood there watching, waiting to see if he would clean the griddle. He decided it was a little too dirty to cook on, so instead of washing it, he picked up a sock off the floor and wiped it down. A dirty, crusty sock. We both immediately said no and walked out to the gas station. He never understood what the problem was. Story 25. To explain the weirdest thing I have ever seen in someone's house, I need to give a bit of background. In Portugal, codfish is usually bought preserved in salt, and before cooking it, you soak it in water for about 2 days. This is normally done in the kitchen, the place where you prepare food. Apparently not for a colleague of mine. One day we had to work on a group project, so we went to her house, and at some point I needed to use the bathroom. When I walked in, I was completely confused to see the shower curtain pulled open, and inside the shower was a large bowl filled with soaking codfish. She was preparing food in the bathroom. That was the last group project we ever worked on together, and I never went back to her house again. Even though this happened 4 years ago, my friends and I still refer to her as the codfish girl, and I honestly still wonder what other strange things might have been going on in that house. Story 26. I am pretty late to this, but I have a great one. It was the beginning of summer, and I was at a party at my friend's house. Let's call him Fred. It was a big party, his parents were gone, and his house was in the perfect location. After a while, I really had to use the bathroom. I checked 2 different bathrooms and both were occupied, so I headed upstairs. That is when I found it, the master bathroom. I was thrilled because it basically became my bathroom for the rest of the night. I kept using it every time. What completely threw me off, and is the real reason for this story, was what was sitting directly above the toilet. Mounted on the wall was a plaster mold of the entire front of Fred's pregnant mother. The entire front. Naturally, I immediately told a few close friends at the party, and soon after, about 15 of us ended up packed into that bathroom, laughing uncontrollably and giving Fred endless grief for a good 20 minutes. I still cannot unsee it. Story 27. I went out with this girl a few times and never saw her apartment until we had been hanging out for about a month. She was a single mom, so I expected toys and general kid mess everywhere, which was not a big deal at all. What I did not expect was how filthy the place actually was. The kitchen looked like it had never been cleaned, with splatters all over the walls and floor around the stove. The sink was piled high with dishes that looked like they had been sitting there since the Reagan administration. The small kitchen table was completely covered with more dishes, papers, and random unidentifiable junk. The living room was just as bad. The couch was covered in crumbs from cookies and crackers, and you could barely see the rug because it was buried under spills, stains, dirty clothes, toys, papers, cat hair, and even a few used diapers. thankfully folded so you could not see what was inside. Strangely enough, the bathroom was actually clean, which just made me wonder if anyone ever really bathed there. She wanted to watch a movie, so we went to the couch where she brushed off some crumbs with her hand and made a comment blaming her messy kid. About 20 minutes into the movie, my allergies started going crazy. I am not usually allergic to cats unless I touch one and then rub my eyes, but there had to be an insane amount of cat dander everywhere, even though I never saw a cat. I was so uncomfortable and disgusted that I excused myself, saying I needed to go to the pharmacy for allergy medication, and then I just went home. She texted me later asking what was wrong, and I told her I was not feeling well and that the meds made me drowsy. After that, I avoided her calls and messages until she eventually got the hint. About 10 years later, I heard she had 2 more kids with 2 more guys, and I can only imagine what her place looks like now. Story 28. My high school boyfriend's older brother, who was 18 and a senior at the time, slept on a bare mattress placed right in the middle of the living room. His clothes were piled next to a computer desk that sat in what was clearly meant to be the dining room, since it was right next to the kitchen. The dining room space contained nothing except that computer desk and Brandon's pile of clothes and books. The strangest part was that the living room was not considered his bedroom. It was a perfectly normal shared living room, the main common area of the house, yet it was also where he slept. The mom and my boyfriend, who was 16, each had their own rooms, and the 2 younger brothers shared a bedroom. To this day, I still do not understand why the oldest brother lived like that. One of the first times I went to their house, I noticed the mattress and thought they were just moving furniture, but then I saw Brandon sleeping on it. I must have been staring because my boyfriend shook his head in an annoyed way and told me not to ask, quickly dragging me into his room. Other times I went over, Brandon would be asleep on the mattress while their mom sat on the couch watching television or reading, and the younger brothers would be doing homework or playing in the same room. Everyone just lived their normal lives around him sleeping on a mattress in the living room, and nobody ever explained it or even acknowledged how strange it was. Story 29. This was probably back around the year 2000. I was really into professional wrestling at the time, and I went over to a friend's house to watch a World Wrestling Federation pay-per-view. I will call him Mike. This was the first time I had ever been at his house, since he usually came over to mine. I kind of expected it to be gross or at least strange in some way, but it actually seemed like a completely normal house. As far as I knew, it was just me, him, and his mom there. At one point, his mom yelled from the kitchen asking, "Rachel, did you take out the trash?" And Mike answered back, "No." I never left the living room, so I did not know who else might have been in the house. I knew he had 2 sisters and thought maybe one of them still lived there, possibly in her room, so I assumed Rachel was his sister and that he was answering for her. I did not think much of it at first. A while later, his mom again called out from the kitchen, asking Rachel something else, and again Mike answered. That started to feel a little strange. I wondered if there really was a sister there, or if his mom was actually calling him Rachel. I tried not to overthink it, but it happened again later, with her addressing Rachel and him responding. I eventually went home without ever figuring it out, always feeling confused about what I had witnessed. I told myself it was probably some kind of inside joke, or maybe she was teasing him in front of me. About a year or 2 later, Mike asked me for a ride home, so I drove him. When we arrived, he invited me inside, and he and his mom immediately started arguing because she had apparently been supposed to pick him up earlier. During the argument, she looked at him and called him Rachel again, saying something like she had already told him she could not come get him. Hearing it years later confirmed that she really was calling him that. To this day, I have no idea what that was about. I lost contact with him a long time ago, so I doubt I will ever get an answer. Story 30. I am not sure if this fully qualifies, but here it goes. When I was around 8 or 9 years old, I went to play at a friend's house, and I remember finding her parents unsettling, especially her father, who came across as aggressive and intimidating. Her mother would sit in the kitchen smoking and yelling at my friend's younger siblings, who were completely out of control. Later, my friend confided in me that her father would hurt her on a regular basis. I remember us playing house one day, and after a while she decided that the mother had died and that the father was now in a relationship with the daughter. At the time, I thought it was strange, but I was very insecure as a child and did not say anything. After that day, we stopped spending time together. I would occasionally talk to her when we were older, and when we were about 14, she told me in confidence that she was pregnant and was going to have an abortion. I knew she was not dating anyone, and she never told me who the father was. Not long after that, she became pregnant again and had a miscarriage. She also struggled with eating disorders. It was not until many years later, about 10 years after all of this, that I thought back to that childhood game and realized how disturbing it was that an 8-year-old would consider something like that to be normal. Looking back now, the entire situation deeply unsettles me. Story 31. One of my best friends in high school lived in a house that was a complete disaster. His mom was a hoarder. It was not quite at the level of those extreme cases you see on television with blocked doorways and things like that, but it was definitely heading in that direction. Most of the tables in the house were completely unusable because they were covered in stacks of random items. The computer room was filled wall to wall with Mickey Mouse memorabilia. The basement was an absolute nightmare. Half of it was nothing but pink boxes stacked from floor to ceiling, each one containing a different doll. In another corner, there were 2 massive shelves holding DVDs of nearly every major movie released since the 1980s, many of them still unopened. Strangely enough, the weirdest thing in the entire house was the bathroom on the main floor. It was barely big enough for a toilet and a sink. On the wall directly across from the toilet was a large crucifix made of a mirror-like material. So if you ever had to use the bathroom there, you were forced to stare at your own reflection while it was framed by a reflective image of Jesus. No one in the house seemed to think this was strange at all. Story 32. Once I was at my cousin's house, and the topic came up that they were dealing with an ant problem, which seemed understandable and not that unusual. I noticed ant traps placed around the house, so I assumed it was being handled. When it came time for dinner, we all sat down to eat, and I noticed an ant crawling on the table. Normally, at my own house, I would have stopped eating, cleared the table, and dealt with it, but instead I pointed out to my cousin, aunt, and uncle. All they said was, "Oh," and kept going. I figured maybe it was just one ant and tried to ignore it. Then I started seeing more ants appear on the table, probably close to a dozen spread around the plates and food. My cousin and his family continued eating like nothing was happening, completely unfazed by ants crawling around their dinner. Maybe they had just gotten used to it after dealing with the problem for weeks, but I personally found it pretty disgusting to be eating food with ants walking around it. Story 33. When my friend Rob and I were 17, we went to the house of a girl he liked named Martha. We met her parents and her 4-year-old sister, and everything seemed normal at first. Martha already had another friend over, so all of us went to hang out in her bedroom, which was big enough for everyone. Her little sister suddenly came running in, jumping on the bed, and almost immediately fell off, hitting her head on the bedpost and starting to cry. Her dad came storming into the room and started yelling at the top of his lungs, demanding to know which one of us had hit her. Rob and I froze, completely shocked, mumbling incoherently while trying to process what was happening. For what felt like the longest 15 seconds of my life, he continued yelling at us, until suddenly he stopped, smiled, and started laughing. Martha casually tapped him on the shoulder, clearly annoyed, like this was something he did all the time. He picked up his daughter and left the room. Rob and I were still shaken, while Martha just laughed it off and said her dad was weird. We made an excuse to leave shortly after, and neither of us really knew how to feel about what had just happened. Story 34. I once knew a guy who had what he proudly called a dump room. Every time he filled a garbage bag, he would tie it up and throw it into that room instead of taking it outside. The one time I visited his house, the rubbish in that room was piled up to about shoulder height throughout the entire space. This was not social housing or anything run down. It was a proper Georgian house in a very nice area, likely worth over €1 million. When I asked him what he planned to do once the room was completely full, he casually said he did not know, and that his father would probably take care of it. He genuinely could not understand why anyone found the idea of a dump room strange or funny. The rest of the house was also filthy and bizarre. He had an oven installed in his bedroom, and one room that contained nothing but a bathtub. The door opened outward, and the entire room was taken up by the tub, with no space to stand around it. As if that was not odd enough, he also had an uncle who had previously been in a psychiatric facility living in the basement. yet claimed he had not seen him in about 3 years. Story 35. Not extremely strange, but I was young and easily terrified at the time. I had just made my first friend at a new school, and she was also new, so we eventually planned a sleepover at her house. I had absolutely no idea I was about to step into something that felt like a Rob Zombie horror movie. Her parents were not only taxidermists, but they also collected horror movie memorabilia. Her father had buffalo skulls mounted all over the walls, and there was a massive alligator head displayed above their big screen television. Stuffed rodents and bats lined the stairway as I walked up to my friend's room. The worst part happened in the middle of the night when I needed to use the bathroom. The only hallway leading upstairs past a loft area where they had a life-size Chucky doll and mock Texas Chainsaw Massacre-style torture props. The Chucky doll was motion-activated and would talk when you walked by. The house was completely dark when this happened, which made it infinitely worse. I should add that despite being cigarette-smoking, leather-wearing, animal-loving people, her parents were actually incredibly nice and very well liked by my strict parents. Looking back now, they would probably be considered cool and quirky, but at the time they absolutely terrified me. Story 36. I had a step-cousin I was friends with when I was younger, who lived in Florida, and we went to visit him and his family. One night I stayed over at a friend's house with him. The very first thing the friend's mother said when I walked in was, "Don't mind the cockroaches, they don't hurt." I immediately noticed there were thousands of cockroaches, all about an inch long or smaller, crawling on literally everything. Being an awkward 11-year-old, I just tried to accept it. In the kitchen, they were crawling out of the dishwasher while my friend pulled cups out for us to drink from. The family claimed they had a boa constrictor that helped keep the roaches under control. We played Smash Bros on the living room television with cockroaches crawling across the screen. Sleeping was the worst part. I slept in a chair after brushing off as many of them as I could. But throughout the night, I kept waking up to flick cockroaches off my legs, arms, and even my face. I assumed this was a temporary situation, but when I talked to my cousin about 10 years later, he told me it was always like that. I still have no idea how they lived that way. Story 37. I think I might take the prize for this one, because my own family was the one with the weird stuff that we thought was completely normal until someone else came over. When I was a kid in Missouri, somewhere around 4 to 7 years old, my family received a collection of dolls and wooden toys from a so-called family friend. As a kid, I thought they were harmless toys showing children with odd hairstyles eating watermelons. And there was also a picture that looked like a pencil drawing of a kid sitting in a cart being pulled by an elderly man with a caption that read something like, "Giddy-ap, Grandpa." At the time, I thought nothing of it. In reality, these were wooden toys depicting racist stereotypes with exaggerated features, and the elderly man in the picture was not a grandfather at all, but a slave figure, with the child holding a whip when you actually look closely. Years later, when my sister was around 17 or 18, she brought a black friend over to the house. We were sitting in the living room watching television when her friend went into the kitchen for a glass of water where those items were kept. She came running back into the living room yelling and asking if we were racist. My sister and I just stared at each other, completely confused, until it finally clicked what those objects really represented. We immediately got rid of all of it, but the realization that we had grown up thinking those things were normal was deeply unsettling. Story 38. One time I was staying with my mate in Leeds for a few nights. One evening I went out with another guy I barely knew at the time, got extremely drunk, ended up going home with a random girl, then left the next morning and started walking back to my mate's house. I tried calling him the entire way, but he was not picking up. He was not answering the door, and I had no way to get inside, so I just stood around outside for the next hour with no idea what to do. Eventually, some random guy came bouncing around the corner and started walking up the street. He was dressed like he had been at a rave or disco all night, which was very much a thing back in 2009. He walked up to a house and started pounding on the door in a very aggressive but oddly casual way, more impatient than angry. No one answered, and after about 20 seconds he turned around and started talking to me. I am terrible with names, so we will call this guy Dave. He asked my name, I told him, and he introduced himself. That was when I realized he was clearly on ecstasy. He asked why I was just standing around doing nothing, so I explained my situation. He then invited me into this random house with random people I had never met, who also did not seem very responsive to the door. I was hesitant, but it was February in Leeds. I was cold, wearing just a shirt and jeans, and my phone was nearly dead, so I accepted. The moment I agreed, the door opened. Dave rushed over and hugged his friend, who looked like a typical stoner type, so I figured things would probably be relaxed inside. Dave introduced me to him, we will call him Tom, and Tom led us into the living room where two girls were sitting around laughing and smoking. One looked fairly plain, we will call her Jane, and the other looked like a stereotypical hippie with dreadlocks and cargo pants. We will call her Rosie. I spent the next couple of hours just hanging out with them. Everyone seemed friendly and normal. Drinks and weed were being shared. I was warm, and my phone was fully charged, so given how my day had started, I could not complain. It turned out Jane was Tom's sister, and Rosie was Tom's girlfriend. At some point, Jane announced she was going to take a bath and left the room. About 20 minutes later, Rosie got up and left as well without saying much, and then Tom left shortly after. After another 30 minutes, I asked Dave what they were all doing. He casually replied that they were taking a bath. I asked what he meant by that, and he told me to come with him. He walked to the bathroom and opened the door like it was nothing. I was hesitant but followed him inside, where I saw Tom, Jane, and Rosie all sitting together in the bathtub. I was completely stunned but tried not to react. Dave then started undressing and climbed in as well. Rosie invited me to join them, and at that exact moment my phone started ringing. I used that as an excuse, stepped out to answer it, and thankfully it was my mate calling back. I did not hesitate, I left immediately. To this day, I have no idea if they were serious or just messing with me, and honestly, I do not even care. Story 39. I had a friend who practically lived at my house on the weekends, staying over all the time, and one weekend her family invited me to stay at their place instead. I rode the bus home with her, and for a while it was just me, her, and her sister, because their parents had taken her brother to the doctor for burns on his face after he had grabbed the wrong gas can while setting things on fire for their dad the day before. When their parents finally got home that night, everything felt completely off compared to what I was used to. Their dad had bought beer on the way to the doctor, which was about an hour away, and had apparently been drinking the entire drive there, back, and even after they got home. He was completely wasted, loud, obnoxious, openly hateful toward his kids, and spoke to his wife like she was worthless. He was calling people on the phone just to talk badly about his own family and loudly telling everyone about how the brother had burned his face. The mom was actually very kind and clearly trying her best, taking phone calls and calmly correcting the mess her drunk husband had just made. The brother was awkward too, loudly announcing that he had to use the bathroom the moment I was introduced to him. I was so uncomfortable that I stayed out of sight as much as possible, only following my friend into her room and then to her mom's room to apologize and ask if I could be taken home. They did not understand why I wanted to leave, and even on Monday at school, another friend casually said that was just how it always was at their house. Story 40. My in-laws' house is something I will never forget. The first time I visited, I noticed tomatoes, lemons, and pears in the refrigerator with chunks cut out of them, just sitting there uncovered, not wrapped or stored in any container. They would also buy a roasted chicken, eat some of it, then put it back in the fridge on the serving platter with nothing but a dish towel thrown over it, picking pieces off of it for days afterward. Another time, my father-in-law announced he was making steak for dinner, and when I peeked into the kitchen to see if he needed help, I saw blood everywhere, all over the counters and running into the sink, because he was slicing fresh kangaroo steaks on the drain board. Completely unrelated, but also unforgettable. When I was in high school, my friends and I used to hang out at a house owned by two brothers who also had a sister. Their father was a raging alcoholic and nobody called him Dad. They all just called him George. The house was disgusting, but it was a place where we could drink and get high, so we tolerated it. One night we were incredibly high and starving, so we searched the kitchen and found some corn muffin mix. We mixed it up, poured it into a tin, shoved it into the oven, and cranked the heat. A few minutes later, the sister went to check on them and came back asking who put chocolate chips in the muffins. When we looked, we realized we had not preheated the oven, and when the heat finally kicked in, it overwhelmed the cockroaches living inside. They dropped straight into the muffin batter, head first. We immediately abandoned the idea of eating and went to the store down the street instead. Story 41. Not exactly horrifying, but definitely one of the most uncomfortable situations I have ever experienced. I was visiting Dallas for a convention with some friends, and since they were American, they knew more people in the area than I did. We ended up going to a girl's house because she could not attend our goodbye dinner. I did not really know her and did not particularly like her, but I did not have much choice since I had not rented a car. So I went along, feeling like a captive audience in my personal version of hell. Her house felt like a bad antique store, not the charming kind. The couches were old, cheap-looking, threadbare, and strangely damp, like they had been sitting in someone's grandparents' basement for 40 years. Everything felt sweaty to me, though I admit I am from Alberta, so humidity is not something I am used to. I managed to tolerate it until I took my shoes off and my bare feet touched the carpet. The carpet had a moldy tint, an awful greenish gold color, and felt like it had been soaked and then left to air dry. The texture was the worst part, somehow both crunchy and sticky at the same time. I had to scrub my feet shortly afterward. On top of that was the smell. The entire house reeked of what felt like years and years of dog urine mixed with musty animal odor. I could not wait to leave, and even now just thinking about that house gives me chills. My American friends from places like Texas, Alabama, California, and New York did not seem to notice anything wrong with the smell, the furniture, or the carpet. So maybe it was just me being foreign and judgmental, but I still think it was incredibly strange. Story 42. My mother's uncle and his family lived in a very old farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. We visited them every 2 years during summer break back in the 1990s. The house was located in a very hot and dry region, and because it had a reliable water source, it was like an oasis in the middle of the landscape. Because of that, it was common to see huge spiders, rodents, and snakes of all kinds wandering around, including venomous ones and constrictors. Taking a bath meant constantly checking the room to make sure there was not a thirsty snake hiding nearby. Frogs and geckos were everywhere, just part of daily life. One cousin even claimed that a snake once fell from the ceiling into his hammock while he was sleeping, which was more than enough nightmare fuel for years. Strangely, the most unsettling thing about the house was not the animals, but its history. About 150 years earlier, the previous owner had taken his own life by hanging himself from the roof. At the time, people who died that way were not allowed to be buried in a normal cemetery, so his family placed his casket inside a wall in the living room and cemented his body upright inside it. When the house was eventually sold to an ancestor of my mother's uncle, the body was still there. Oddly enough, that part never really bothered me. I even have photos of the visible bulge in the wall where the body remains. I was always far more afraid of the snakes. Story 43. I have been waiting to tell this one for a long time. When I was around 19, I was working a miserable retail job in a strip mall. One of my coworkers casually mentioned that he sold weed on the side, so one day I asked if he could help me out. He said no problem and invited me over to his apartment on the other side of town. The following weekend, I drove over to pick it up. When he opened the door, he was wearing a bright purple robe that was very clearly a woman's robe because of how long it was, holding a bong in one hand and a can of whipped cream in the other, which honestly should have been my sign to leave immediately. He invited me in, told me to sit on the couch, and asked if I wanted to smoke with him before I left. I declined and explained that I was meeting my girlfriend and her parents for lunch and did not want to show up high. He said he understood and told me he would be right back with what I came for. While I was sitting on the couch digging through my pockets for the $40 I had brought, something in the corner of the room caught my eye. There was a large fish tank, the kind you might see in a small dentist's office. The tank was absolutely filthy and grimy, and I initially thought there was no way anything could survive in it. Then I realized there were no fish inside at all. What was in there almost made me stand up and leave on the spot. Inside the tank was what looked like the front half of a stuffed tiger posed like a sphinx, cut cleanly in the middle with its back legs removed, and stitched onto it with thick black leather thread was the back half of a trophy fish, like a bass. Submerged in murky, foul water for who knows how long, the thing was partially decayed and looked like pure nightmare fuel. When the guy came back into the room with the weed, I just stared at him and pointed at the tank with what must have been a look of absolute horror on my face. He casually said, "It's a tigerfish."